As I mentioned earlier in today's first reading, the book of Job, we get an opportunity to investigate one of the great questions known to mankind. Why do bad things happen to good people? Well, spoiler alert, we probably won't answer this to everyone's satisfaction. It's a mystery, but I'll take a stab at it. The book of Job is one of the most intriguing books of the Old Testament. For those of you who aren't familiar, I'll give a brief synopsis of this book. So Job symbolizes every believer undergoing trials. I would say that's generally all of us. Job is a righteous man. He loves God and is obedient to him. He has been blessed abundantly with an ideal family, good health, and even abundant riches. He has it all. But he doesn't take it for granted. He knows that all good comes from God, and for that, he is grateful. And when God praises Job's devotion, it makes Satan very jealous. So Satan asks God if he, meaning Satan, can tempt Job to see if he remains faithful. And tempt him he does. He takes away everything that is precious to him: his children, his animals, his property, and ultimately his health. Everything but his wife. But his wife is really no help. She tells him to curse God and die. Remember, both Job and his wife suffered the same loss. They both lost their children, but Job chose the better path. And with no comfort from his wife, he seeks solace from his three friends who come to comfort him. And when they see the horrible state that he's in, they tear their garments in sympathy, and for 7 days they simply sit and grieve with him, saying nothing. Now, that seems to be the only right thing they did in this whole story. So after those 7 days, Job began to cry out, to weep, and to curse the day he was born. But unlike the suggestions from his wife, he never cursed God. But instead of comforting Job in his misery, his friends began to berate him, assuring him that he must have committed some hidden sin to deserve this mystery, because God never allows the just to suffer. But Job doesn't buy into their accusations. He says that if he could only present his case to God, he would be delivered. So then, in a lengthy dialogue between Job and his friends, he ultimately utters the famously prophetic line, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at last he will stand upon the earth." Now, he didn't know Jesus, but we know now that our Redeemer indeed lives, and his name is Jesus. And finally, in the midst of Job's complaining, which we hear today in the first reading, God appears in a great storm. But he doesn't accuse Job of anything. Instead, reminds Job that he is God and Job is not, and that God's ways are not our ways. It's a lesson in humility. He also condemns Job's friends for speaking falsely, because Job had been closer to God than they were all along. And an interesting twist, he also tells Job to pray for his friends. Ultimately, the story has a happy ending. Job is rewarded with many times as much happiness as he had before, which symbolizes the heavenly Jerusalem rather than a promise of material gain here on earth. I know that's a lot. It's a lot to unpack. What can we learn from this? Well, so much, but I'll try to narrow it down to 3 things that struck me from this book. First, we all know someone who is suffering and doesn't deserve it, or someone who has experienced great loss. It's difficult to know what to say or to do. We know that mere words or even actions fall short in providing the comfort we wish to give them. Job's story gives us an example of what not to do, not so much of what to do. However, the suffering of others can give us a great opportunity to practice empathy. Now, many of us confuse empathy with sympathy. Well, sympathy is generally our relief in not having the same problem as the other person. Basically, it stinks to be you. But empathy is our ability to understand how someone feels, but also to enter into their suffering. We can't necessarily fix their problem or judge them. We simply walk with them. Job's friends had the right idea at first. Sometimes we just need to sit in silence with them, to just be. Second is understanding the simple truth about human life on earth that applies to every single person who ever lived. That this life can indeed be full of misery, but also full of joy, but that this world is not enough. Job's complaints about time and drudgery and misery and restlessness are echoed in St. Augustine's famous line that says, "My heart is restless till it rests in you." But here's the thing, we should be restless here. It's okay to complain to God about it. Our ultimate happiness is not in time, whether in work or at rest, but in God, in eternity. He is not one among many good options. He is the source of all good. Finally, from great suffering can come great good. This is perhaps the hardest one to believe or to understand because we don't always recognize this great good. Sometimes it happens without our knowledge, but sometimes it becomes quite apparent. I'll attempt to give you a very personal example of this. I've experienced tremendous loss in the last 18 months. I lost both of my parents and most recently my wife. Mary Ann was perhaps the most righteous person I've ever met. There's no way that she deserved to suffer and die in the way that she did, but she did suffer and die, leaving me to wonder why. Job's story did give me some solace. As in the case of Job, I have full faith and confidence that Mary Ann is resting for eternity in the heavenly Jerusalem. Now, in the months prior to her death, she and I had lots of discussions about the meaning of her suffering, especially her lengthy suffering. We were comforted by the fact that there were so many people, many of you here today, that were praying for her. And in this mysterious cycle of grace, the people that were praying for her were receiving blessings because of their prayers back to them. So this cycle of grace, the more you put out, the more comes back to you. Now, since her passing, I accepted the role of coordinator of liturgy at this parish. And I've discovered, much to my surprise, there are numerous responsibilities in this role, but perhaps the most important one is funeral ministry. It also might be the most rewarding one. Just recently, a few days ago, I met with a family whose mother had passed away. They had suffered great loss, and when they got there, they were rightly distraught. We spoke about their mother, who was also a righteous person. We shared stories about our loved ones. We consoled each other. By the end of our meeting, we were laughing about things that our loved ones said and did. Hopefully, they left feeling better than they did when they arrived. There were no magic words. There was nothing that I could do or say to bring their mother back. But entering into each other's suffering somehow made both of us feel better. I was able to find some meaning in Mary Ann's passing. God has a plan for each of us that is not always evident. We can only surrender to His will and trust in His providence. But brothers and sisters, it all boils down to this. When tragedy strikes, or when bad things happen to us, and trust me, they will, we really only have two choices. It's binary. We can either run toward God, or we can run away from God. Which will you choose? St. Anthony of Padua.